Good afternoon. I'm Wolfgang Hiller. I'm Director in the European Parliament Research Service, EPRS. On behalf of EPRS, I would very warmly welcome you to this online policy roundtable on Xi Jinping's third mandate, What Next for China? This is one of many events EPRS is organizing on topical issues of interest to our parliamentary community within the House, but also to a wider public. In fact, a last roundtable of this kind took place yesterday. There, we were looking at the United States and the upcoming midterm elections early November. Today, we will turn to developments in China, a country which, in many respects, has now become the number 2 globally. As many of you will have seen, last Saturday, the Communist Party Congress, which takes only place every 5 years, came to an end with the presentation of the new and old General Secretary and the Standing Committee of the Politburo. So our discussion today shall focus on what the Congress means for the Chinese people, for Chinese and European businesses, and for China's future foreign policy. Mrs. Elena Lazarou, our acting head of the External Policy Unit within the Members' Research Service, will moderate the event, and she will also be the one who will introduce the panelists later today. Before that, however, I'm more than happy to welcome Mr. René REPASI from the S&D Group in his capacity as the Vice Chair of the European Parliament's Delegation for Relations with China. Mr. REPASI is also a member of the Committee on the Internal Market and Consumer Protection and a substitute member of the Committee on Economic and Monetary Affairs and the Committee on Legal Affairs. Mr. REPASI has kindly agreed to deliver the introductory speech today, and he also has accepted to take some questions immediately after his intervention. With that, I hand over to Mr. REPASI. Mr. REPASI, the floor is yours.
Yes, thanks a lot, Mr. Hiller, for having invited me to give this keynote speech here. Indeed, in my capacity as first vice chairman or president of the EU-China delegation of the European Parliament. And here, everybody was, of course, very closely looking at what was happening this weekend, given, as you rightly said, this party congress is happening every 5 years, and it is of high importance which direction China is going to take in relation to what was announced there. Now, we did have, and we knew this already before the Party Congress, a remarkable outcome, given that the already kind of traditional rule was broken that a Secretary General cannot have more than 2 mandates, and that Xi Jinping got reappointed in this position for further 5 years, which is a step unseen since the times of Mao. And we all probably remember, in terms of images that come from this party congress, this very moment in the very beginning, just after the international press was led into the room, where Xi Jinping's predecessor, Hu Jintao, was helped, if I may call it, to leave the room. And it was, of course, explained that there were health reasons, but one cannot escape the impression that it was a symbol given to the world of a break of Xi Jinping with the rather moderate traditions of his predecessors. So, and that was setting the tone for the analysis of this party congress. I mean, we will hear now later in the panel more details and more information about this. Hence, I will also restrict myself to a few introductory remarks in the following. Now, if you look at the decisions that we're taking in terms of the personnel, we can see that in the Politburo Standing Committee, which is the ruling body, we can see that there is a clear relationship of loyalty with those members and Xi. We are not speaking anymore of a primus inter partes, but only of a primus that is having here a particular role. terms of substance, I think it is very remarkable that it was announced that GDP is not going to be anymore the central metric for measuring China's global success, but that they refer to the notion of national strength. And I do believe that this has meaningful implications, which we are probably also going to discuss about in the panel that is going to follow. It is also notable that the GDP numbers were not published before the Communist Party's National Congress, since also experts already analyzed before the Congress that China's growth is going to be less than it wanted to actually achieve with 5.5% and currently being around 3%. Still excellent growth numbers, but in relation to the self-set targets, it is of course remarkable. Moreover, we have there was a certain tension whether there's going to be any remarks on the future of the zero COVID strategy, and there was no reference made to this. And also given the personal choices made that Li Qiang from Shanghai is going to get the role of the prime minister, meaning a city that was very strict on the zero COVID strategy, is also an indication that this strategy is for the time being not lifted. What does this now mean in terms of the relationships between the European Union and China? Now, we have listened to the remarkable silence on the war in Russia. It is, of course, rather in the tradition of party congress speeches in China that you do not refer to current affairs. But the silence is, of course, remarkable. And this very silence also shows that there is geostrategically a lot in the move. For Europe, we have to take, in my eyes, one consequence of that. We have to realize now that the very fact that we are suffering from this war in Russia economically so much has a lot to do with the lack of diversifications in our economic relationships with Russia. But if we compare our trade balance that we have with Russia with the one that we have with China, then we are talking about two very, very different issues. So if we were ever in a situation that Europe would have to take the same kind of sanctions vis-a-vis China as it was currently done vis-a-vis Russia, because China were to attack Taiwan, which is nobody seeing any indications for, but just for the sake of an analysis, then we wouldn't be able to do so. Which requires that at this particular moment of time, we need to very well analyze how our trade relationships are composed and where we do have dependencies with the need to do more diversifying. It is particular in that context that I also see a huge potential and interest of our own economies in the current discussions all around the corporate sustainability due diligence directive, as it forces our undertakings to make a very in-depth analysis of their own supply chains and to which extent that leads also into China. So that requires an analysis of our own relationship. And let me then conclude with one thing that is of course always of high interest when we are discussing the relationship with China. It is the question of Taiwan. And here in the speech, what we have heard was a reference to a renaissance of the Chinese nation and the strategy of one country and two systems, by which the Chinese leadership, in my eyes, made very clear that any attempts to go into a direction of a worldwide recognition of Taiwanese independence could be answered with force, which is, in my eyes, something that is at this moment of time, but in general, not very visible. So in that sense, it is a clear position that the Chinese leadership has taken with regard to Taiwan. Now, these are then my first thoughts and ideas in this keynote speech that will bring up some questions and challenges for the following panel. And by that, I hand over back to Eleni Lazarou.
Thank you very much First of all, welcome to all the audience on my behalf. Welcome to our speakers. And thank you, René REPASI, for having really set out the scene for the topics that I think we'll be delving into today. The Congress that took part last year and has in many ways, in all ways, consolidated Xi Jinping's leadership, the state of the Chinese economy, the impact of zero COVID, the situation with Taiwan and how it will evolve, but also EU-China relations. And all of these issues are ones on which our speakers will come in a bit. But as Wolfgang has foreshadowed, we had foreseen some time for you to respond to questions before our speakers debate those issues in the roundtable. So I want to come back to you with the first question that has been posed, which is, as a member of parliament, would you be able to comment a bit on the future of the comprehensive agreement on investment with China? Is it dead for the EU, or what is the scope for that in the future?
Now, the situation is that here we are a bit stuck, and for the time being, especially in my capacity as an MEP, I see little movements towards a conclusion of this agreement. There are a couple of barriers, and to start with also the rather tense relationship between the European Parliament and China, and sanctions against single colleagues of mine. In that sense, at this particular moment of time, I'm not very optimistic of a rather soon conclusion of this agreement.
Thank you very much for that. I don't see further question, but perhaps I would add one of my own to you before I move to the panelists, which is China is the world's biggest energy importer as far as I have followed. So both in terms of oil, but also in terms of gas. And in a somewhat fortuitous series of events, the zero COVID policy has meant it's reduced its energy needs. And that has somehow, as a domino effect, enabled the rest of the world in terms of the share available in a time when we are facing a serious energy crisis. So I wondered if you would have any thoughts once the zero COVID policy, if the zero COVID policy is relaxed, whether this will have an impact on Europe in terms of energy issues. I know Jakob Kierkegaard will probably go into this as well later on, but also if you see the outcome of this Congress as foreseeing a laxening or a tightening or a relaxation of the zero COVID policy that Xi Jinping has implemented very strictly.
My reading of the Congress is here that there is no relaxation of the zero COVID policy to be expected in the soon future, because it was not mentioned at all in the speech, and because of the decision to promote Li Qiang that was responsible for a very tough stance on the zero COVID policy in Shanghai, and who is going to most likely continue this policy in his more prominent role. So that is my reading, that we will basically see a continuation of the current policy.
Thank you very much for your response to that, and thank you for your introductory remarks. I think you've set the scene, as I said, in the most in-depth way, and it is with that I then move on to introduce our panel of speakers that join us today to discuss many of the issues you have mentioned, but also, if I may say so, to follow up on the last discussion that we had on China with the very same panel of speakers. It was in June, and at the time we had an event on China's economic situation. Many foresaw that it would not be a favorable one for Xi Jinping. At the time, of course, we did not know the outcome of the Congress, so it was actually an agreement that we would reconvene to discuss the future of China's economy, politics, society, and international relations following the outcome of the Congress. So both as a follow-up to that event, but also as a follow-up to the Congress and what we've seen, as outlined by Mr. REPASI, I'm very pleased to welcome here today Jakob van Kierkegaard, who is a senior fellow with the Peterson Institute for International Economics and the German Marshall Fund of the United States. Welcome, Jakub. Yu Jie, who is a Senior Research Fellow in China, Asia Pacific Program at Chatham House, and Ali Sekman, Senior Analyst in charge of Asia, Europe at the European Union Institute for Security Studies, the EUISS. And last but not least, my colleague Ulrich Joheim, who is our Policy Analyst in our External Policies Unit at the Members Research Service of the European Parliamentary Research Service, and who works on China, among other East and South Asian issues. Welcome to all of you. It's a pleasure to have you here, not least because for anyone following this Congress, all of you have been commenting in media and podcasts and other outlets, which have been very helpful in dissecting and understanding what is going on. So it's really a pleasure that you found time to discuss this issue with us today. To the audience watching us, at the moment we have 110 attendees and many following by live stream. I just wanted to signal that you can ask your questions while our speakers are speaking using the chat function or the Q&A function, and we will be picking them up after all speakers have made their initial intervention. So please feel free to introduce questions as they speak. The best thoughts sometimes come while the speakers are speaking, so please feel free to add the questions there. Without further ado, I won't introduce the topic further because it's already been introduced. We are all very eager to hear about China's future, not only because we are under the shadow of Russia's war on Ukraine and China has its particular position or non-position on this that is also affecting global geopolitics and international relations, including with the EU, but because I think no one could have followed the news last week without noticing the tightening of the sense of concentration of power in China. And we are all, given how important China is for us in terms of supply chains, the economy, global geopolitics and global governance, trying to understand what that will mean for the world and for the EU. To understand all this, I'll turn first to Jacob Kierkegaard, who will introduce the topic against the backdrop of all these events and also offer his thoughts on the economy, on energy, on the Russia war. How will China be dealing with all these issues following what we saw last week? Jacob, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Elena. It's a pleasure to be back with you today. As mentioned, I'm going to focus on the economy and leave a lot of the political and other changes to my fellow panelists. Well, basically, taking the cue of what is the sort of main economic impact of the outcome of the People's Congress, I mean, I guess I'll say at least two things. One is that it was already alluded to by Mr. REPASI that the incoming team, as I look at it, doesn't look much of a reform-minded crew to me, at least. We have a prime minister who is clearly appointed mostly for his, loyalty to Mr. Xi. Damn the economic consequences of his actions in Shanghai. It's already also been mentioned that there is no signaling of the reopening of the Chinese economy after COVID. I personally always felt that was a bit sort of wishful thinking, because the reality is that China is not going to be able to do that until they have a vaccine that can really protect the elderly Chinese population against Omicron and later variants. That means they have to develop their own mRNA or agree to import it from, or import quote unquote Western technology. So far, that has not been desired. And the domestically developed vaccine mRNA has now, I think, been in large scale trials for a very long time, which is the same as saying that it probably doesn't work. And what that basically means is that I think the baseline should be that the Chinese economy remains in this kind of on-off lockdown from COVID, certainly in the short and likely even in the medium term, meaning throughout 2023 as well. Because so far there's no indication of a material improvement of the vaccine situation in China. This is, as was already alluded to in the questions, probably good news for Europe in the short run, because it means that China will very likely be importing less LNG, which is good for Europe's supply situation. But it is also, in my opinion, overall very, very bad news for the Chinese economy and also therefore for the world. Because I think a perpetuation of these lockdown policies interact with the sort of deeper structural challenges that the Chinese economy face in a very negative way. It's no secret to most now that China is on the cusp of a dramatic, really truly dramatic demographic transition. Basically, if you think Japan has had demographic, difficulties in the last couple of decades, if you think there are some countries in Europe that has it, forget about that. The situation in China is much more dire. On top of that, China is clearly experiencing, you can pick your noun, an apocalypse in the housing market, a slowdown, unwinding or whatever. But clearly the Chinese housing market is under very severe pressure, which we know very well from many European countries 10 years ago, that containing the fallout of a large real estate bubble bursting is very, very difficult and leads to prolonged slowdown in growth. On top of that, China, it's not just the housing market, but China in the entire Chinese economic model has been so heavily driven by investment. It's been, pretty much when you invest 42 to 44% of GDP for well over a decade, it's inevitable that the return on that investment begin to decline very rapidly. The latest estimate would suggest that the incremental capital output ratio in China is now 8. What that basically means is that if you want another unit or renminbi of Chinese GDP, you have to invest 8 renminbi to get it. That's another way of saying that unless China fundamentally changes its growth model, leverage and indebtedness in China is just going to continue to rise. And with it, the prospects, unlikely at the moment, I should add, but the prospects of a future large-scale financial crisis will only grow larger. And unfortunately, if you look at the measures taken by the Chinese government to sort of combating the COVID lockdowns, they very much go in the wrong direction. The Chinese government, partly because they don't actually have the tools with which to do it, have chosen very different ways than what was done in Europe and what was done in the United States, where the principle, apart from lockdowns, of course, was large stimulus to households to boost consumption. China has gone exactly in the opposite direction. It has given various amounts of tax cuts to businesses and tried to further stimulate the Chinese corporate sector. Chinese public infrastructure investment. Basically more of the same. Very likely further leading to further increase, or will certainly lead to further increases in indebtedness, and ultimately not, in my opinion, prove a sustainable boost to growth. It also means that unlike the situation that we had in Europe and the United States, where once the economy was eventually reopened, most household and businesses, they had a lot of money on their hands. There was a boom in the economy. That is unlikely to happen in China. Basically because households are not awash with cash. There is not a significant increase in the household savings rates, etc., in China coming out of COVID. So we should not expect China to reopening with a bang. So basically what China has going for it in the short to medium term is a really large boom in exports. How long that can last obviously depends on global growth, but also I think it's certain to, in the not too distant future, stir further protectionist measures or sentiments in many countries with whom China now, Europe included, has ever larger trade surpluses. It also means that I think we need to be very alert to the fact that China may very well choose to devalue its currency. They now run a sort of soft peg to the US dollar. Obviously, for that reason, it has been strengthening. I think there's a real risk that China decides to let its exchange rate peg loosen further, which of course certainly for the Asian region would, in my opinion, be very potentially very traumatic. On the issue of Russia, it is my view that Russia will likely lose the war with Ukraine within the next 6 months. This is very clearly, politically a setback for Xi Jinping. I don't necessarily think it will matter much for China economically. The Russian economy simply doesn't matter enough. And likely China can continue to benefit from low-priced Russian energy exports. But certainly, strategically, politically, it's a major setback for Xi Jinping of basically having backed a loser. I would also say that Mr. REPASI mentioned that the CAI, the Comprehensive Agreement on Investment, is probably dead politically in Europe. I would basically say, you know what, with China's economic forecasts of basically, which is in my opinion, we shouldn't expect the Chinese economy to grow more than 2% a year in the long run from now on. That's not much more than we grow ourselves, or not much more than what the United States grows. So what that means is, first of all, it signals, in my opinion, a slowdown in overall global growth. But it certainly also, in my opinion, means that the commercial importance of the CAI is probably overblown. It doesn't actually matter that much for the European economy going forward. And I think that's my 10 minutes. So let me finish here. Thank you.
Thank you, Jacob. But a lot of interesting points there, and a rather low prediction about Chinese growth. I think that the IMF is foreseeing 4 point something for 2024. So you are more pessimistic than the IMF. But we keep a lot from what you've said about the COVID, about energy, about trade, about Russia losing the war. We'll hold you to that. And also, I think importantly, will China's economic power be the same in 1 or 2 years? And also, you mentioned very interestingly the moves in terms of legislation in the US and the EU, which could also, in combination with its more limited growth, mean that it declines in trade power. Really interesting thoughts with global impact. Now, I'll ask our next speaker to zoom in on the more domestic yet immense Chinese landscape. Yuje, it's a pleasure to have you with us again. You've been commenting on a range of media on last week's Congress in terms of what it means about Chinese politics. Contrary to others, you referred to the atmosphere as not at all triumphant, but rather somber and very much in the context of a sort of realpolitik or realist approach to what should happen going forward in the face of numerous crises. So I turn to you to hear your analysis of what happened last week, but also what should we expect in terms of the political priorities of this third version of Xi Jinping, and how will they unfold?
Thank you so much, Elena, to having me here. Delighted again to join EPRS event, and also thanks for Uli to have invited me here. Now, Elena, I mean, the word of somber tone that seems to come from Jacob's assessment on the Chinese economy, but I think that's also come to the assessment from the Chinese Communist Party last week as well. Interesting anecdote is really for the first time that while you're holding a party congress without having flowers on stage, I think that's unprecedented compared with, in the last 20 years. So that's just a signal. Now, secondly, it's not just a signal, but secondly, if you look into the full draft report, the full draft political report, that over 30,000 words, much of the context is the keyword strikes me is that keyword for security, which had 37 mentions. I mean, that's far more than the economy, for example, has been mentioned 68 times. It is a very interesting report that has not referring anything about the United States at all, but it's essentially about China's strategy and a policy trajectory, that how China is going to deal with a worsening Sino-US relations. So that's my sense. Hence, Xi Jinping coming to this whole notion on a broader version of a Chinese national security, and therefore to promote economic growth. That's a part of national security. to close the income gap between rich and poor. That's part of the national security. And most importantly, to be able to achieve that sense of technology self-reliance is a part of national security as well. And very interestingly, apart from, he did not really offer a recipe for how to save the economy, but instead he did offer a recipe for how to achieve that sense of technology self-reliance. Whether it would work or not, let's judge by the result in years to come, not to draw the conclusion too quickly. But there has been a new section on that political report, the section number 5, that referring to China will have to groom its homegrown talents that will be able to solve the solution of the semiconductors, to be able to solve the readiness of all many other key strategic industries. And the key word in here is homegrown, which is essentially is talking about that China facing this deteriorated international environment. It's very unlikely that the Chinese students and Chinese youngsters will be able to study abroad, and especially on those cutting-edge technology-related subjects. And therefore, China would have to able to producing its new generations of engineers in order to empower the economy. Now, secondly, what I've noticed is very interestingly, compare and contrast in the past two congresses, and he placed the importance in the past on the finance, on the capital, but this time he placed the importance on high-end manufacturing. So essentially, he wants to rebuild China as more kind of high manufacturing world factory, rather than just a China that only producing cheap export to Europe and also to the rest of the world. So that is what he has, that notion, again, by using technology self-reliance as a way of drive the economic growth, which is a very different from in the past, where you're using infrastructure investment, you're using property sector development to drive the economy. But I think from now on, again, what he intended to do, it is to use that sense of technology investment to drive the economy. So whether that will work or not, I don't know really, because as we know that innovation can only take off in a society that would allow to have a fair competition within the market economy. It cannot always be state-led. So what China is trying to do now, it is to double down that state-led innovation, state-drive the innovation, whereas on the other hand, not necessarily encouraging the private sector would play a greater role in drive the economy. So given this political report, I think that really has spooked many private sectors. They would really wonder what exactly presidency is really after to them. So that would really hinder the private sectors to making further investment, irrespective if it's on semiconductors or on any other technology-driven industries at all. So that would also, again, to trickle down and prevent further employment being generated across the society, as well as we know that the majority of the Chinese employment are generated by private sector. So we're in a very interesting picture. Yes, it's quite right that from Xi Jinping's point of view, to be able to deliver a sense of technology self-reliance. But on the other hand, he does need to have the private sectors on his side in order to fulfill that goal he has in mind. So that is one thing which really strikes me, even if you're talking about technology self-reliance, go hands in hands with equitable growth. Very interesting, but I consider there's a permanent contradiction within that, as the reason I just set out earlier. Now, the second set of question in here, it is to let's observe the composition of Politburo member. I'm not talking about standing committee of Politburo. I'm talking about the team of 24, the Politburo members. 6 of them have come up with a PhD degree on natural science and physics and nuclear science. So again, it's a clear indication from now on, China will be entering the era. It is no longer the pragmatic economic planners, like you have people like Zhou Xiaochuan, Guo Shiqing, Liu He, to arrange the economic policy. But instead, you have a generation of engineers now begin to arrange economic policy. Therefore, more point towards to technology self-reliance. So quite interestingly, the composition of Politburo is deeply intertwined together with that political report he set out. And it's actually quite interestingly, for the first time, I think the Wall Street will be quite unhappy as they will not be able to make any phone calls with any of those Politburo members at all, because none of them actually have any direct connections with any of the investment banks in the United States. So that is something quite unprecedented anyway. Now, let's zoom into the other section. Again, as we said, the relationship with the rest of the world. Again, it's something quite convention busting, that for the first time, Xi Jinping did not referring to the term, the so-called strategic opportunity for China. So in the past, that is a term by suggesting that China would have relatively peaceful relationship, stable relationship with the West. Hence, that would provide China opportunity for boosting economic growth. And then also, for the first time, Xi Jinping did not making the reference for the term of new type of great power relations. Again, a term referring to China's relationship with the G7 liberal democracies. That means the party comes with a firm conclusion. The much fraught relationship with the West is here to stay and is not going to ease at any time soon. And therefore, Xi Jinping has devoted like a large section of the political report on the foreign affairs section on developing its relationship with the developing economy, with the global South, and stress the role of the Shanghai Cooperation, as well as on Global Development Initiative and Global Security Initiative. So this really leaves us somehow, the party has really no any incentive anymore somehow to develop some kind of sense of amenable relationship with the advanced economies. So that's really laid bare the very somber assessment of the party come to the realization, perhaps there's no way that bridge between China and the West can be reconciled at any time soon. So even, as I said, this political report has not made any reference on the United States, but I think it's all against the background of worsening China-US relations, but also against the background of Russia's invasions towards Ukraine, that China will be able to guarantee its own food security and guarantee its own energy security. So really for me, as I read, it is not about triumphant declaration of the victory of the party. Really for me, it is trying to tell the rest of the country and also the rest of the world that we're going to be facing a new China that is very much inward looking, a new China that is firmly interested in its own domestic affairs. So I ended in here and much look forward to hear your comments and questions.
Thank you very much. Extremely interesting. Also, if I may say so, in its implications for EU and obviously US and others policy, because for the better part of the last decade, we have been devoting time, energy, and reflection in creating policies for an outward-looking China, and in many ways, a China that was exporting a lot and to the degree of distorting markets. Now we're looking at a different type of China, inward-looking, and yet, outward in its region, I also understand a lot of security-related threats, which is a very good way to move to the next speaker, Alice Ekman. Alice, I've been following your work for a while, and I remember, if I'm not mistaken, you also wrote about a foreign policy shift in the last Chinese Communist Party Congress several years ago. In fact, since 2013, you argued there's been a change in Chinese foreign policy, and obviously now we're seeing the contours of what would perhaps be a new Chinese foreign policy, the domestic determinants of which, as Yuji has said, would be the trade and tech in autonomy or independence, but also a relative degree of inward lookingness, if I might call it that. Then again, there's a lot of security related issues in the region that China seems to be very assertive on. And then there is China's general engagement in multilateral organizations, its relations with major and smaller powers, including the US and Russia. So how is it looking for you following the Congress on that front, and any other topics you'd like to come in on?
Thank you so much, Elena. I'm very happy to be back, and I fully agree with all what has been said before. And in a nutshell, China is closing. The opening on the opening speech of, the report pronounced by Xi Jinping at the opening of the Congress is very clear about this. Jacob mentioned no adjustment of the zero COVID policy. To date, we have 200 million Chinese citizens under lockdown in 28 Chinese cities. But beyond the zero COVID policy, I think it's important to emphasize what the two speakers also pointed at is that the hierarchy of priority is pretty clear in the speech. Economic development is important, but it's not the priority. The priority is security, including political security. And it's important to mention, and I will go after to foreign policy development, but it's important to mention this frame because it has consequences also on the way China positions itself internationally. In a nutshell, China is ready to pay the price of some of its political and geostrategic position. We mentioned a zero COVID policy, but also we could refer to the strict implementation of the national security law in Hong Kong since the summer 2020. And in the speech of Xi Jinping, it's clear that there will be no adjustment to that. He mentioned that order has been restored, and that it's important to ensure that Hong Kong is administered by patriots. And this policy has been costly in terms of image, in terms of relationship, for example, with the EU. It's a point of tension, but also in terms of financial attractiveness of Hong Kong as a marketplace itself, to the benefit of other hubs in Asia. For example, Singapore has welcomed a growing number of regional headquarters of European companies in recent months and years, but this has not led to an adjustment of China's position towards Hong Kong because the priority is not financial attractiveness, it's political stability. And the list is long. We could mention Xinjiang, we could mention other issues which have not been specifically developed in Xi Jinping's opening speech, but the hierarchy of priority is really apparent in his opening speech. Political stability, security is key, and this also leads me to the fact that I consider this speech very ideological. There have been clear reference to Marxism. You may say, okay, this is just communication. No, it's not. It's really not just communication. Wang Huning has been confirmed as one of the seven most, the leader of, seven most influential person at the CPC, at the top of the CPC. And the Marx, it doesn't just mention Marxism, but also a new development philosophy. And this also is very important to mention because it goes back to the fact that China is closing, in a sense that Xi Jinping and some of his advisors, such as Wang Huning, consider that for too long, China has adopted element of capitalism, which was needed to take China out of poverty after the Cultural Revolution. So thanks to pragmatic, I would say, mixer of different frame of economic reform. But now that China has consolidated its rank as second largest economy, it's time to go back to the path of socialism with Chinese characteristics and lean towards communist ideal. It's really important to emphasize this because this will have consequences on the way China interacts with the US, with the EU. And in a sense, we should not expect, I would say, opening up of Chinese market anytime soon. From my perspective, even if it's costly from China, and even if the speech of Xi Jinping mentioned remaining open to foreign investors in one way or another. Ideology is also important because what it shows, what we can really anticipate, is further supervision of the economy by the party. You remember that the technology sector, the private education sector, the entertainment sector has been, I would say, controlled now, reshaped by the party in great respect. And we should expect an extension of this control to other sectors in the coming months and years very strictly. And I would go further and say that this ideological renewal that we are saying lead us to anticipate further control of the Chinese population. I'm not just talking about the political control, but in terms of consumption practices. Xi Jinping mentioned fighting hedonism, He mentioned also fighting money worship, egocentricity, and we are already seeing control on some of the population behavior, and this will continue further. So this means that China it will be closing at several levels, and this trend is long term because it's ideological. It's developed within the party itself, and it has been, of course, reinforced with external factors, including sanction, trade and tech sanction, and the Sino-US tension that are very much deep. I mean, that's very, very much long-lasting. I agree with Thier that the US, I mean, it's a fact that has not been mentioned directly in the speech. At the same time, Xi Jinping mentioned gross provocation when he talks about Taiwan, which of course it is alluding to the US, and also mentioned foreign interference on several occasions. So when it comes to foreign policy, more specifically, I partly disagree with the inward-looking approach, or maybe I misunderstood this concept. I agree that China is developing an ideological renewal that is leading to a partial closure, but it doesn't mean that its foreign policy will be less ambitious or less proactive. On the contrary, China will very much continue to promote its coalition building strategy by reaching out to countries that it considers friends, and at the same time maintain a so-called wolf warrior diplomacy towards countries it considers enemy, foreign hostile forces. And this includes several EU member states, according to Beijing. So this coalition building strategy will continue to be promoted at two levels. Multilateral level, China will continue to invest within the UN system in terms of participation, finance, and general lobbying and activism. And I would say the convening power that we are seeing, for example, at the Human Rights Council, when China has managed to gather a number of countries that were able to to vote against holding a debate on Xinjiang, for instance. But this coalition building strategy will also be promoted at bilateral level very actively through the promotion of Chinese technologies abroad in particular. Of course, China is losing market share when it comes to telecommunication technology, especially, Huawei 5G's technology, but in some other places in the world, Chinese technologies are still very much welcome. I'm talking about the promotion in Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, or part of Southeast Asia. When it comes to Taiwan, more specifically, the paragraphs mentioned in the report of Xi Jinping are very interesting because they indicate a very differentiated approach. Xi Jinping is talking about supporting patriots and fighting against separatist forces and foreign interference, what he calls separatism and separatist forces. So this differentiation leads us to anticipate a very targeted promotion of Chinese objectives when it comes to Taiwan. I'm talking about cyber strategy, cyber attack, disinformation, also using the economic leverage to also support some of what China calls patriots in Taiwan. Xi Jinping mentioned that the use of force is not discarded, but it's not obviously, at least in the speech, it's not the priority. And in any case, it will not be targeted all Taiwanese, but separatist forces and foreign interference. So I think it's important to decipherate this discourse on Taiwan very carefully and not to rule out lawfare. We're talking a lot about the different tools that China can use to promote strategy towards Taiwan. And, China has used law towards Hong Kong to promote its objective. And the fact that Taiwan, the refusal of Taiwan independence is now enshrined in the constitution, for me, is the first step of lawfare strategy that will unfold in several respects, but that should be taken seriously. And I will stop here by saying that from an EU perspective, it's important to anticipate the potential law option that China may use towards Taiwan and how the EU and EU member states will respond to these moves.
Thank you very much, Alice. All very interesting there, and this lawfare concept as well. I feel that warfare in our times has gained thousands of dimensions, and we are just looking at it from different perspectives. But a lot to discuss there in the Q&A, I think, about the inwardness and external looking dimension of what we will expect to see from China already forming. I want to, before I turn to our last speaker, remind the audience that you can already ask questions in the chat or the Q&A. We already have a couple. They're all Taiwan related, which is quite telling. Yesterday we had an event on the United States and all the questions were China related. So it's all becoming one big interconnected geopolitical discussion. Moving from that to our colleague Ulrich Joheim, who's been writing about the Communist Party Congress for EPRS, but also will speak to us to a degree about the EU's relations with China. I note that in 2019, the EU the Commission came up with a strategic outlook on China, and the European Parliament in 2021 voted on a resolution for a new strategy towards China. So as I understand from our experts, a changing China, would that require a new strategy? And Ulrich, the floor is yours for that, and many of the other points I know you've written on and would like to make about what China will look like in Xi Jinping's third mandate.
Yeah, thank you very much, and thank you for all the other panelists for your great contributions. I will just comment on some aspects. I think we all agree that the period that the Party Congress was the last proof we needed to show that the period of hyper-globalization, as some have called it, is over. Now also the most export-driven, trade-oriented country probably the world has ever seen has decided to turn inwards. There I agree. I also agree with Alice a lot that the speech by he was very ideological. And I made a comment immediately to a friend, and I think also to Dear later, that China has really become communist. This is actually the point, because if you look at the speech, and I like your reference to hedonism, Alice, because I think he mentions it 3 times in the speech. So what he says is like the period, especially under Wen Jiabao and Hu Jintao, I guess, was a period in his view of disorder. I guess he would say disorder. And this is the reason I feel. And no, I think for he, the main impact this disorder has on current affairs is that the real estate problem is really as bad, I think, as Jakob has described it. So in a certain way, the fact that Liu He is out, that Li Keqiang is not going to be confirmed, that the 2 vice premiers, Wang Yang and Hu Zhonghua are out, and that even the governor of the People's Bank of China will be removed, is a sign that, in my opinion, that he considered that this horrible period of disorder, which is also in his view responsible for the very serious state of the real estate sector, must be over, and that he has managed to find a solution to the problem of hedonism, what does he say, extravagance and formalism, as I said, mentioned 3 times in the report. So actually, yeah, a period is over. The third mandate is the beginning of a new period. I have not fully understood whether he really believes that he is equal with Mao and superior to Deng or not, but that, I mean, it's more a kind of theological observation to make. Then on Taiwan, and I agree and disagree with Alice at the same point. I think it's worth pointing out that this kind of what we also have called hyper warfare or hybrid warfare is going on. So it means you use all available means below actual warfare to manipulate your adversary and to improve your own geostrategic situation. But this has been going on for some time against Taiwan, and I think Taiwan is one of the countries best prepared to face off disinformation because they have really developed already a very sophisticated system. I found actually more interesting on the military side, because one of the elder statesmen who was kept is Zhang Youxia, the general who is 72 years old. And the main reason on top of being very closely linked to the family of He, the main reason seems to be that he has actually war experience. He participated in the Chinese invasion of Vietnam in 1979. And the same, I feel, somehow applies to the second vice chair of the military center, Central Military Commission, General He Weidong, whose main competence in the past was that he was commander of what they call Eastern Territorial, sorry, I've lost the word, Eastern Territorial Defense Area or something, which incorporates the province of Fujian, which is opposite Taiwan, and who, it seems, developed the strategy applied by China when the Speaker of the US House, Pelosi, visited Taiwan, which I think we will agree was a very clever one, because China used it to very slowly, very gradually improve its geostrategic position towards Taiwan. So in this sense, I think on many issues, actually, I think he wants the cake and eat it, and the same applies in a certain way to Taiwan. So he plays both strategies, let's say the hybrid warfare, but also preparing for the contingency of a serious issue regarding Taiwan. And I agree with Alice. I think the main focus now is to have an impact on the 2024 presidential elections in Taiwan and to manipulate public opinion, because he's probably afraid that they might be tempted to go for more independence after the term of moderate President Tsai is over. So as I said, I think I would say China has really become communist. It's turning inwards, and he believes he can have the cake and eat it. I'm a little bit skeptical on the innovation part, which Lydia mentioned. And I believe there's a big danger, because we agree the state of the economy is very bad. So he's trying to go for the innovation technology thing. I'm not sure they will manage. I'm afraid if he doesn't manage, he might be tempted by one foreign policy advantage. So yes, there is a need, I think, given all this, for us to adapt. I agree that probably the Kai will not go ahead. It was not very likely before the speech. It's even less likely after the speech. We have seen businesses in Europe are becoming, we all know Jörg Wuttke, but who has been pretty outspoken on that one too. Business becoming much more pessimistic. Small and medium enterprise, it seems, are hesitant to further invest in China or tend to diversify. Clearly, the EU will pursue a strategy of supporting the diversification in any respect. Again, there's nothing new, I think, because von der Leyen has already announced that we would restart negotiations, or we have restarted FTA negotiations with India. We are trying to restart them with Indonesia and the Philippines. So I think this is a very clear sign of where the EU is heading in this respect. But all these tendencies, in my humble opinion, have only been reinforced by the speech and by the party congress. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ulrich. A lot there as well, domestic and external side. And I think, yeah, this challenge of innovation and technology, I don't know if this is shared by the rest of the speakers, but the jury still being out with the controls that will be globally imposed through, legislation in other parts of the world, through the supply chain issues. So I guess, like many big powers around the world, the innovation and technology challenge seems to be one at the forefront of Xi Jinping's thinking, and it may determine a lot about the global constellations and allocations of power in the future. All very interesting. I have several questions of my own, but I will start with the questions already posed by the audience and perhaps add my own to them as we go forward. So as I said, a first set of questions to our speakers is on Taiwan. And maybe I'll group all those together and come back to you, and then we come back for a second round of questions. So on Taiwan, there's been one question by my colleague Kjell van Veeringen, who is in our Strategic Foresight Unit, to Yuje and Alice, but I think everyone can chip in. Will China's economic slowdown encourage or disencourage aggression against Taiwan in the next 5 to 10 years? More specifically, will deteriorating economic prospects mean that the Communist Party will look to forcing a change of the cross-strait status quo as an alternative source of domestic legitimacy and diversion of attention away from internal problems? Or will it cause a slowdown of its military rise and undermine its future confidence to take on the United States in a potential military confrontation? So that's quite a big question, but essentially it's the question about, will the economic impact on Taiwan be more, intervention, or will it be a sort of fear of competition with the United States? And here I'll slip in a question of my own, which is, Xi Jinping has promised sort of modernization of the Chinese military, if I'm not mistaken, by 2035. But given the economic predictions that Jacob made, how much leeway is there for China to spend that much on security and defense? So that, I think, could tie in with that question. And then there's a couple of more questions on Taiwan. One is to Alice's point about lawfare. What are examples of lawfare that China could undertake against Taiwan? So could you elaborate a bit more on that point? And then a question on, if China tries to invade Taiwan as Russia did with Ukraine, what should we expect the EU's reaction to be? It's a shame that Mr. REPASI is not with us to respond to this question, but if anyone would be willing to take a shot at that one. So what would the EU do in the case that China takes the moves to invade not Ukraine, obviously, Taiwan. So I'll turn back to you with this first set of questions, and then we'll go back to the audience for more. So maybe I will start in reverse order, or rather start with Alice, and then you, Jay, because you had questions specifically directed to you, and then Ulrich and Jacob, if you want to chip in, I'll come to you. So Alice.
Thank you. Very interesting set of questions. I have trouble taking seriously the diversion argument when you talk about, China's foreign policy moves. China's foreign policy has been very ambitious and to some extent violent for over now a decade, and independently of the growth rates. I mean, considering that that the foreign policy move, including towards Taiwan, would be a variable of economic growth, would lead us to think that that Xi Jinping is not so ambitious when it comes to foreign policy. He's very ambitious, and this ambition will remain independently of the growth. You may say, well, China also needs money to support its foreign policy. It's an active diplomacy, but China now has the largest diplomatic network in the world in terms of the number of embassy and consulates, second largest defense budget. And Taiwan, Taiwan is a long-term one, as you know. I talking about the renewal of the Chinese nation. We know that the ultimate deadline is 2049. So you may have a lot of economic hiccups until then. And you have milestone, you have intermediate deadline of 2035. So I'm not saying it has not an impact, but it would have an impact on some of the tools that China is using. For example, economic leverage toward Taiwan, but still, I think it would need to be, much more severely affected by slowdown, not to be using this leverage anymore. So it's a matter of proportion. When I was talking about lawfare, it's very interesting to indeed to imagine what could be the scenario. First of all, China has used law before, and in particular, existing extradition treaty to target some Taiwanese individuals. I don't know if you remember, but since 2016, China repatriated or sent criminals from Taiwan who were doing phone scam in Kenya or Cambodia or Spain, and instead of them being sent back to Taiwan, they were sent to China. I don't know if you remember that development, but the China was using extradition treaty to remind Taiwan that it can use law to target some of its individuals, and that Taiwanese sometimes can be Chinese according to a law defined by Beijing or according to bilateral agreement that have been signed. As you know, China adopted an anti-secession law in 2015, which is very broad and very general. So a move could be to fine-tune that legal framework and make it more specific and turn it into a unilateral unification law. without any specific military move, political move, but a framework that is more specific, and ultimately may target what China sees as separatist individuals or institutions. Already since 2020, Beijing has drawn a blacklist of separatists from Taiwan, individuals or institutions, especially individuals who are unable to enter the Chinese territory or unable to cooperate with mainland Chinese institutions. This blacklist may enlarge and be more specific and tied to more specific set of punishment. This is all imaginative, but there is some basic cases that may be developed. And again, I know the situation in Hong Kong is very different, but the adoption of the national security law and the strict implementation of it surprised many, including in Europe. And I don't know many of us who anticipated such move and such the strictness of the implementation of such move. So we should get ready to the to things that are not necessarily obvious to us. I know some analysts in Washington are talking about blockade of Taiwan, about large-scale invasion. I don't buy it at all. I'm not saying that the military option is not on the table, but China keep promoting a targeted and different strategy to target what they call as separatists and foreign forces and promote or support who they see as patriots. So having an undifferentiated and large-scale attack would not be in line with the declaration and would not, I believe, be in line with Beijing interest.
Thank you, Alice. You, Jay?
Thank you. I mean, this is a great question. I'm not sure I can provide any firm answer for that because things are developing. What I can say is obviously the language on Taiwan has a bit update. So on the one hand, the term unpeaceful reunification still remains to be there, but on the other hand, to use military action as a last resort, also there as well at the same time. And also quite interestingly, the word on anti-pro-independence forces within Taiwan has now been put within the party constitution. So that for me is a language upgrade to deter those who are seeking independence within Taiwan. So that's the rhetoric level. But when it comes to the pragmatic measures, what Xi Jinping can do, I think for so far, given the current economic record, and he can do very little. Even though we have seen that how powerful he is, but all this point to me that in the last 10 years, he's not a risk taker. He's not someone that willing to sacrifice the party's legitimacy that by giving up all the economic record that he has achieved so far and all the economic, all the wealth that has been achieved so far for China, that in exchange to having a taking over of Taiwan firstly. And secondly, if we're asking across the Chinese society, would the Chinese public be willing to give up their reasonable living standard at this moment and exchange for having some sense of running an island and perhaps another clear no from the Chinese population as well? Now, thirdly, at societal level, I think we can all come to the conclusion that after what has happened in Hong Kong, the biggest headache for Beijing, it is not about taking over Taiwan. It is not about resolve the Taiwan question. It is about if there might be a military escalation, how Beijing is going to manage the post-takeover Taiwan. And for me, and also judging by all the language from the party, they seem to have no any satisfied solutions yet. And they also, I think the Communist Party pretty much give up. The Kuomintang, the then incumbent party, used to have a good relationship with China in the past as a way of somehow manage to have that sense of reunification. So really it's the post-takeover management would really hinder Beijing to taking any military action at this very moment, I would say, so in the medium term. And also quite interestingly, again, Xi Jinping has offered no timeline within his party congress, like in the past. So clearly the patience is there and Beijing was still hoping that time is on their side. Now, also across the society, across the Chinese society, we're all one-child family, would any Chinese middle class will be able to willing to give sending their only child to fight something that is completely unnecessary. And perhaps that reason laid bare for Xi Jinping's assessment towards Taiwan. I think it's really the societal reason really bounded him not to taking this military opportunity or military adventurism like what Kremlin has done. Another moment in here I would consider is really what can China do? I mean, Russia's invasion towards Ukraine has offered Beijing a live simulation and how much the economy will suffer if any unnecessary military intervention has been introduced. And Beijing won't handle better than Moscow at all, because what Beijing is producing right now and generating the income and GDP are export-oriented earnings that could be easily being replaced by other manufacturing nations in Southeast Asia. But what Russia is offering right now as a primary material supplier, that Beijing is not in that position to do so. So all these reasons added together for me, almost a silver lining that perhaps this military intervention, it is unlikely to happen at any time soon.
Excellent set of points there, and a lot, as you were speaking, of course, that makes us think of what's happening in Russia, as you say, at the same time. But to think of that as lessons learned for China is a very key point. Yeah, Jacob, would you like to come in on any of those Taiwan questions?
Yeah, no, I mean, I basically would just want to, totally agree with the latter number of points that Yuji made. I think the one-child policy, the implications for combat readiness of China's military it's a very live one. But I think more broadly, certainly if you take an economic forecast that is anywhere near mine, which people may think is very negative, but if that's the case, what certainly we have seen in Ukraine is the advert of drone warfare and a whole bunch of other things, which means that if China were to actually invade Taiwan, China can destroy Taiwan for sure, but can they invade it without large-scale new investments? I personally doubt that very much. And in a slowing economy, that costs money. And with regards to how China is going to be able to fundamentally change its economic growth model, it is going to have to, in my opinion, spend a lot more money on social safety nets that cover also rural areas, etc. That also costs money. There's going to be a very direct competition for funds in a country that may only grow, as I see it, perhaps 2% a year. It's not going to make it any more palpable for Xi Jinping to pursue, if you like, foreign policy adventures. And then finally, I think the point that Yuji made about sanctions on China and your question about how would Europe respond, I think that is a very good point. There are undoubtedly China is a bigger economy. So sanctioning the Chinese economy following a military confrontation over Taiwan is going to be a bigger deal than sanctioning Russia. No doubt about that. And there will undoubtedly be a very, very large number of European industrials who will, cry and say it'll be a disaster. And many of the same companies that are going to be accompanying Chancellor Scholz to China in a few weeks. But the reality is, as we have seen during the pandemic, as we are seeing now with the gas dependence on Russia, trust capitalism, trust global supply chain flexibility, the actual true long-term dependencies on China, I think will turn out to be a lot lower than we think. And therefore, we should not, be discouraged from a forceful stance against China in that situation with regards to sanctions because of the risk of these long-term dependencies. They are, in my opinion, largely overblown.
Thank you, Jacob. Ulrich, any comments on the set of Taiwan questions?
Yeah, first, I found another interesting quotation in the work report because he was talking about strengthening of mechanisms for countering foreign sanctions interference and long-arm jurisdictions. So I think that's the first thing they have probably learned from our sanctions on Russia, because I think if I were Chinese, I would be extremely preoccupied by my foreign exchange reserves in particular. And China has many more, let's be frank, than Russia. So there is an issue there. And the fact that he's preparing for sanctions, I think shows that in case of a declaration of independence by Taiwan, I really think China will be serious. So we shouldn't downplay that. The issue is, and I think Udia made a very valuable point, that Taiwanese public opinion has turned strongly in favor of independence, not least because of the treatment of Hong Kong, let's be frank, which has set a very bad example. So, and Taiwanese young people are less emotionally attached. That's also a very important issue. Those from the elite which fled with the Kuomintang to Taiwan, like, it was 73 years ago. But the grandchildren, they don't no longer have this strong emotional attachment the first or even the second generation had to the mainland. They would still consider them, you know, like I'm from Sichuan or I'm Fujian. And now they define themselves also as Taiwanese. So there is an issue, I think he seems to be very well aware of it, that the discussion in the run-up to the presidential elections might take, from his point of view, an unfavorable turn. So it cannot be completely discarded that there is a risk of, you know, things turning out not as well as we assume currently. Then on the issue of sanctions, again, I think, let's be frank, the EU will not have the choice. One of the main reasons why Korea and Japan are supporting us on Russia is clear that they're afraid that they might be back in a very similar situation, for example, on Taiwan in the medium term. So I think their support for us is linked to the strong expectation that we support them in case of Taiwan. And clearly our friends from the US, who, let's say, unfortunately do the major effort in supporting Ukraine compared to what the EU, both at the level of member states and the EU as such does. Our US friends would also, I think, exert a certain pressure on us to impose sanctions on on China, sorry, in case of an invasion of Taiwan. So I think we won't have the choice. But I agree with Jakob. I was a little bit surprised because we always say, I used to be German macroeconomic desk, how strongly Germany or German economy is depending on China, but now our exports to China less than 10%. And this compares to the figure of 30% more or less for Australia and 42% in the case of Taiwan. So in a certain way, probably I would think, let's ignore the issue of semiconductors for the time being, which would complicate issues a lot. But perhaps the indirect impact via less trade with Japan, Australia, Korea, and Southeast Asia in case of serious sanctions on China might be more important than our direct reliance and the direct consequences of sanctions on China.
Thank you, Ulrich. All very interesting. Now we have some questions from our colleague Jérôme Legrand from the Policy Department of the External Policy Director General. Jérôme is interested in your views on the similarities and differences between Russia and China, which we have already referred to a degree, and the possible reciprocal influence one exerts on the other, particularly Russia, which seems to a degree to inspire China, but also, as Yuja has mentioned, also to sort of give a sense of what China should not do. But is it also a liability, this relationship with Russia, and how do you see that playing out? And then he's also asking for your comments on the situation between China and Lithuania and the tensions with the European Union and particularly European Parliament members recently. So that's two sets of questions there. Perhaps I'll ask Jacob to go first on this.
Yeah, sure. I mean, economically, obviously, you know, Russia and China are night and day. I mean, China is literally the biggest manufacturing economy in the world, and Russia is a gas station, right? I mean, it couldn't be more different. You can say that, you know, they're complementary to each other, for sure. But, you know, you look at the history of the two countries and you have to conclude they're not natural strategic allies. They are right now united in their anti-Americanism, no doubt about that. But as I said earlier, I think that the imminent strategic defeat of Vladimir Putin is also a setback for Xi Jinping, for sure. So, I don't think that from an economic point of view that there are anything other than clearly China takes advantage of Russia's fire sale of energy. No doubt. But more importantly, China is not supplying Russia with large amounts of war-related material. There's a reason why Russia has to buy drones in Iran, right? They're not getting them from China. The Russian railways are about to gradually fall apart because of a lack of ball bearings. They could get those from China if China wanted to export it to them, but they don't. Same thing on a lot of issues. So the depth of the, limitless relationship, or whatever the term was, I forgot, is very much visible. So yeah, that I don't have any particular views on Lithuania. So let me stop there.
Alice, I want to turn to you, but maybe add on to that, we're less than a month away from the G20 Leaders Summit. We are very far away from knowing who will actually be there in the end. But perhaps adding on to the question about Russia-China relations, what should we expect from Xi Jinping with regard to G20 in terms of pushing for Russia to be included or heard or being neutral, or the divide, or leading a group of countries that has a different stance than the US and the EU on Russia, or none of that?
No, we should expect China pushing for the presence of Russia. China has presided over BRICS this year, BRICS meetings and summit, and Sergei Lavrov was there at the ministerial meeting. Most Russian representatives were there. And also China did not only play an active part in maintaining the presence of Russia in some multilateral organization. And of course, we could think about Shanghai Cooperation Organization as well, in addition to BRICS and G20. Not only maintaining, but also China has trying to shape the agenda so that the war in Ukraine is not monopolizing it. And actually, we saw divergence in bilateral and multilateral encounters with China, because China considered that other issues should be put on the agenda, and basically Russia should not be pointed at as much as it is in the G7, for instance. So China-Russia, I agree with what has said Jacob, but I have a perspective that is non-economical, and I think that is complementary to yours, Jacob. I see a very strong. You said okay, they converge in their resentments against the US, but it's not a minor convergence. It's a very deep, it's very deep, a very clearly announced convergence, and which materialize frequently in coordination in key multilateral organizations. Both countries, and they mentioned it very clearly on the 4th of February joint statement in the margin of the opening ceremony of the Winter Olympic Games in Beijing, both countries mentioned their ambition to shape a new world order, which is in substance post-Western. We may, have diverging views on whether they will succeed or not, but the ambition is very strong. China has been repeating still until today, the talking point of Russia saying that basically NATO and the US were basically they were fanning the flames. They were responsible for the provocation of Russia, and therefore China is understanding the response of Russia. So and this rhetoric still very much exists in Chinese official communication, not just across Chinese media, but also when you listen to a spokesperson from Ministry of Foreign Affairs. When you read Vladimir Putin's speech that has been pronounced on 30th of September, shortly after the referendum, 1/4 of it could have been pronounced exactly with the same words by Xi Jinping. When he emphasized, when he denounced the colonialism of the West, that they mentioned that the West is in decline, that it's time, to be proud and not to to obey to the hegemony of the West, etc. All this rhetoric is very much present in Xi Jinping's foreign policy orientation. We have been arguing that China-Russia rapprochement is a marriage of convenience for 8 years now. Since the annexation of Crimea in 2014, we're saying, okay, Russia is just turning east. It will not last long. It's just pragmatic. It's because it has to find an alternative in the front of a Western sanction, and China is buying cheap oil, etc. Okay, but it's not just that. Both countries have been conducting military exercise, joint military exercise in the Mediterranean, in the Baltic Sea, in the South China Sea, in Siberia, in Central Asia. Both countries had been cooperating in many military organizations. We've been mentioning it. Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin met more than 30 times since Xi Jinping is in power. And the convergence of discourse is also a convergence of action when it comes to coordination at bilateral and multilateral level. It's all a matter of proportion. I'm not saying there is no point of tension between the two countries. I'm just saying that the resentment, again, what they see as the West is so strong that it unites them and help them, come over the difficulties and the imbalance of the relationship, which is a reality.
Thank you. It reminds me of some elections we've been discussing recently, where several motley crews of voters are united by their non-desire for a specific candidate. So rather than being united by interest, you're being united by your opponent. But of course, what you mentioned about the relations having continuity is extremely interesting. At the same time, there is this big issue now of Central Asia, I think, and in the end, which of these two powers will exert most influence there. We have discussion with Shanghai Cooperation Organization and all of that looking very interesting, also in terms of what China will continue to do with its infrastructure support for connectivity in Asia. Yuji, on this Russia-China issue or any other, because we are almost close to the end, so if you want to bring in any extra comments, this is the point to do so.
Okay, thank you, Elena. I mean, taking all the points in here, one way I want to say is that you're going to remember China and Russia are completely two different types of power. Russia is a 19th century geopolitical power exerting its influence through geopolitical conquest, whereas China is a 21st century economic powerhouse that exerting its influence through financial and economic means. And that is just the fact of today. Now, the reason why Beijing made such an interesting choice on the 24th of February, I think this is largely due to this, what I called it earlier, the national security mentality. Don't forget, Beijing and Moscow share the border around 4,500 kilometers. That is the width of Europe. So essentially, if you travel from London to Edinburgh, that's the distances of the border between those two countries. So I think what China consider in here, if it cannot handle a stable Russia, and that's going to be Beijing's biggest security threat. So I think that's prompt Beijing made that choice. I mean, I'm not saying I'm trying to just looking for excuses, but I think that's really reflecting a thinking within Beijing right now. But obviously, this diplomatic misgiving has been rather unexpected. And the person who made the comments about so-called no-limit cooperation has been downgraded and being marginalized and put aside. And that is a clear indication that Xi Jinping is not very satisfied at all. I mean, to be honest, that person was supposed to be the foreign minister, the next foreign minister of China, and a Russian specialist, now being put aside. That is a clear indication Xi Jinping is not happy with the situation right now. Now, how can they roll back? For me, that seems to be very difficult. But however, there has been some significant rhetoric changes. If you're observing the differences on Wang Yi's meeting with Kuleba in April, and also the meeting which they just held in September, that seems to be China is now more willing to engage within Ukraine post-state reconstruction. But whether they will arrive at that stage, we're not sure. And also this depends on the capability of Beijing is having right now. But on the other hand, I think it's really for Beijing is they have to realize what the choice they've been made has made Beijing completely lost the opportunity to somehow reconcile its much fraught relationship with the European Union in last year. So that for me, that is a really a missed opportunity But I think overall, Beijing is now trying to be more careful on its engagement with Moscow. And also, don't forget, China retained a very good relationship with Ukraine as well. So before the war, if you look into the foreign direct investment and assistance, Ukraine is ranking top 10 countries where China's foreign aid would go. So that's just to show you that Beijing has no interest for this war to let it last for so long, and also damaging its economic interest in Ukraine as well. So for me, it is a major diplomatic misgiving to see how whether Beijing would have the wisdom to roll back and manage somehow to do this diplomatic balancing act.
Thank you. And it's not the first time this past week that I've heard that this understanding and thinking about China's role in the reconstruction of Ukraine will be very interesting going forward. Uli, it falls to you not only to be the last to give your comments, but also to take the last question that has just been asked, which is, does the communist ideology of China play a role in its relations with various regimes that define themselves or are defined as leftist? Or is China's perception of itself as communist a counterweight against the US, and that's the most important part of it? Which is a really interesting question. I'm sorry we don't have more time to discuss it. It's posed by Nerijus Prekevicius, a colleague. So Ulrich, to you, and if you want to come in on that point, but really shortly, because we have
I think most people here will know that China distinguishes between communist countries and non-communist countries. So in theory, like for North Korea, the International Bureau is normally in charge and less the foreign ministry. So they make a distinction, but I was wondering, asking myself the same question this morning, because the Vietnamese president or secretary general is the first visitor after the party congress to Beijing. And I think Vietnam is really a symbol of this question, you know, kind of emblematic for that question, because as I said before, the last military aggression by China abroad was against Vietnam in '79, when it was already a communist country. And Vietnam is clearly trying to hedge against China, both with Russia and the EU. There's a reason why we have very fast and early on agreed an FTA with Vietnam. So in this sense, I don't have a definite answer to be frank, because as I said, Vietnam is an extremely interesting case in point, but I'm not sure how far they are going to take that. If I may make a comment, a short one on Russia, I think sometimes we are in the West probably a little bit too black and white. I really believe that he thinks he can have the cake and eat it. So he can have black and he can have white. So he can have good relations with Russia. He might be able to stabilize Putin. I guess he believes, and he might have more leeway to do so, while at the same time, you know, playing a more positive role on Ukraine. As I said, the speech is all about have the cake and eat it. So we can be market oriented, and we will promote state-owned enterprise. We will be peaceful, and we will not renounce non-peaceful means. And this goes through the whole speech. So I think our discussion is really, and Udia is already laughing, and I know why, because also the Japanese, you know, or the East Asian in general, believe that we are too ideological. And I think I start to believe that they might have a point.
Thank you very much, Ulrich. So to sum up, a climate of sobriety and yet a have your cake and eat it speech and approach. A China which is likely to not grow as much as even the IMF is forecasting, which is less than it was growing some years ago, but faces the challenge of technological innovation and keeping up at a time when Western powers are increasingly tightening their export controls of such tech and potentially trade towards China. Interesting relationship with Russia, which may not work to its advantage in the future vis-a-vis those other great powers. And Taiwan, which may or may not be the next victim, but may not be the next victim because of the situation between Russia and Ukraine, which gives an example of how overestimating a potential successor military intervention can backfire. So this is my small and failed attempt to summarize some of the points we've discussed. But I think it just goes to show that China continues to pose a number of questions. Xi Jinping's third term has just started, and I think there'll be a lot for us to look at in the coming years following that. A lot of interesting proposals for legislation and strategies in the Commission work program for next year that are directly or indirectly related to our relations with China in the EU. An open question mark about a potential new strategy, as the Parliament has requested, but also on the other side of the Atlantic big pond, a lot of legislation, some of it explicitly named as legislation related to China, and some of it not, but implicitly really being about China. So there's a lot to watch. I want to thank our speakers once again for their insights. To also mention that while we have many events, we will not be having one next week because it's a time for rest and of the soul and the saints. So we will not be having an event next week, but please follow our website to look at what our next events will be. As is customary, the video of this event will be made available, a blog post will follow, and the publications related to it have been distributed. Thank you very much to everyone for being here with us today. Thank you again to the colleagues and friends for the insights, and I hope to see you again very soon. So thank you.